The NDP will immediately eliminate the medical and premiums for both individuals and companies.
False.
Why is it false?
To cut it by 50% right away, and the eventual goal is
For 4 years.
Nice work. Yes, you guys are picking up all the right things. So yes, 50% right away, and then over you have 4 years or so, they're going to try to eliminate it altogether. The individuals and companies part is for both. Okay. 5. What new arrivals to BC are eating the grass and hay crops in parts of the province?
armyworms.
I don't need the fancy need. And you get a bonus mark if you know where they came from.
Mexico.
Let's go in South America.
There you go.
What if the answer is like really descriptive of it being worms?
Okay. Anybody else have a question? Yeah, I'll take worms. Hi. Don't talk. She's here. Sorry. Over here with me. Okay. Sorry. That's okay. Grab a pen. Okay, so guys, any more questions before we tally up? Yes, Charlie.
I was unclear about where they came from. Mexico and the USA, Mexico and South America.
As long as you can get it over the border of Mexico, I'll accept. So anything Mexico or South, I'll accept. So again, next time you will need to know, like you can't call them what they look like. You'll need to know what they're being called. I don't need the actual scientific name, but again, it will get a little bit tougher as we go. Okay, so good job. The bonus mark means that the test is still out of 5. So some of you will get a 6 out of 5 if you got it perfect, which I'm not expecting this time around. So if you did, good for you. But just add it to whatever the score might be. So if they got that correct, okay? So tally up the scores, give it to the person who originally did the test, have them take a look at it, and everybody pass it forward to me. And take out your papers so you have them, and we'll go over some of the things.
Hey. Thank you. Thank you.
I know.
All right, so the paper that we were all very familiar with last night.
I know.
So as we read through these, hopefully yours will look similar to this kind of thing. Hold on, we'll highlight some of the things that I think are important to know. Okay? So while you're reading this stuff, while you're getting used to reading this stuff,
No.
okay. If I come in the next day and I'm asked to follow the story, well, I know a little bit about them. I know where they came from. I know what they're doing and why it's a problem. Okay? So who's being impacted by the? So if you mention this to someone, you go home to whoever you live with and say, oh, there's this story today. Let me tell you about it. You're going to hit the high points, right? What are these things? What are they doing? Who's upset about it? Where did they come from? What are the questions that they're going to ask? Those are the things you're looking for, those highlights in each story. Which is pretty simple when you're talking about, infestation. And the fire and so on is, let me talk about this next and get back to that. Okay, but then you get something like this, the NDP, and what they're doing, their promises. Now this is a different story altogether. This story is packed full of information, as you believe were thinking as you were going through it, and you were reading. So this is the kind of story you do pay a little more attention to. You highlight all the things that they mention, and you notice on the next page they go into greater detail about certain aspects of this. So they elaborate. Story that you would elaborate on the next day. So what are some of these things the NDP is doing? Rental housing, what else have we got here? Things people are happy with, some things people are questioning. Education, we've heard a lot about education, and that happened right around when schools were opening and right before, but a little bit about education. So what haven't we heard about that we might cover the next day? So you want to have that in mind while you're listing all these things. Like, what haven't I heard about, and what would I know that I want to know more about? Is something confusing? If something's confusing to you, it'll be confusing to other people too. So you'll think, this might need some clarification. That's a story. So, and again, if you're pitching stories and you see something like this, and you have a way to humanize it, to make it relevant to people, or to make it a little more understandable, that's a story. And, as we go further into what we do, you'll learn how to pitch it so it becomes a different angle, a different story. But when you're reading this stuff, that's how you get your ideas for the next thing, the next story, your pitches. Put a list of things together, okay? So that gives you a lot to go with. And then I want to draw your attention to this one on page 4 at the bottom. Red flags raised over eco-certified CP methods. Now, where did they get, what was the impetus for this story, do you think? It says so right at the beginning, Trevor.
C-Choice released a report.
There you go. So C-Choice released a report. As soon as you know that a story is being done off of a report, you can find out who did the report. Okay? Do they have a vested interest in anything? And the other thing you do is you look and see if the article has anyone but that person as a source, or that group as a source. Did this happen? Yeah.
Yeah, they did.
Right here. Right? So this was well done. You will see others that are not as well done as this. Okay, they run with the report or the poll or whatever, and it was taken by, whoever. Like, we'll talk about it later, but Coca-Cola doing a survey on something to do with romance, men and women, whatever, and, their logo is on everything. It doesn't have anything to do with anything. And, who cares? It's one of those, whatever polls, but it's so that they can get attention. So if it's a company that's looking for attention, it's almost an ad that turns into a news story. Okay? So you look at those. Okay. And what else? Healthcare spending. There's another one that needs to be simplified a little bit. There's so many stories you can do out of that one thing. And it's, if you read through it, full of numbers, full of things, you could do almost anything.
I didn't find out where they mentioned where they're going to be receiving that money from.
Which, the healthcare?
Yeah.
Yeah, well, that's the thing. They're saying, okay, you're making all these promises. How's this going to happen? So that's something that's a larger story. And you'll go, it'll...
Where are they getting it from?
Yeah. Thanks, Clay. Okay, grab a seat somewhere. Okay. Well, that's a good question. And you're going to have to follow the news to figure it out, because they're not necessarily telling you.
No, they're not.
Yeah.
And it's a big article.
Sure it is. I mean, just so much you can do if they're not telling you. You can't beat it out of them. All you can do is go in the air and say they're not saying.
2.something billion.
It's a lot of money. Yeah. Healthcare is a huge, huge issue, and the fact that they're doing this is very questionable, I think, all the way around. Because we've been hearing, we don't know how we're going to afford this in the years to come. Now, all of a sudden, we can afford to get rid of our premiums. So it's a huge question why they've gone that way. And finally, the Bacon story. So when you're reading about crime stories and something like this, which has been ongoing, you'll need to have a little bit of a past, knowledge, a little, history on the subject. So I wasn't too tough on you with this. Most of us probably don't know all the names of the accused, just that they're gang members. We all know the Bacon brothers because they were, they did a lot of, terrible things. And usually, you'll hear about the heads of different crime rings. Okay. So,
will you be asking us names, like other particular names in current cases and articles?
How do you mean?
Like side players, or like not the head of the gangs, but all the other names mentioned? Could that ever be in one?
Well, if you're a crime reporter and that's your beat, you'd know them all. But if it's not your beat, you're not likely to follow it unless it's a shooting or something that's happened suddenly. Okay?
Like, can we expect to see that on quizzes?
On quizzes, I'm not going to get into the historical part. Like if it's Picton or something, I will expect you not to know the people who were affected and their families, but know a little bit about Picton, and I expect it to be said in the story. Yeah, I wouldn't give you anything that wasn't. So can am I able to get on D2L?
Yeah, through here.
Okay. Okay, so next thing, we're not going to have a lot of time before this person shows up. I want to tell you that whoever is looking for and Chloe, I'll do this after class. Where'd you go? Okay, I'll do this after class with you. I'll go through it. Okay, okay. Remind me so I don't forget. Yes, so textbooks. It's going to be not this week, but next. So those of you who I have a list for, here we go. I will call out the list and I will hand you your reading for next week with just chapter 1 for everyone. Okay? Chapter 1 in the textbook. And in the meantime, I need you guys to pass around this. So, pass it around. This is for our seminar. Pass all the way around. And readings. Allison, come on up. Natalia or Natalia? How do I say that? Natalia. Natalia. Thank you. I have a friend named Natalia, so that's what thank you. Call her. Okay, Chloe. Nick. Nick. Now I only have first names or last names. Martins. Clark. Dion. Okay, you're welcome. So hopefully you guys can get your books on next week. She said they were on back order. Okay, so everyone should have their own books who I didn't hand stuff to. Is that right? Yes? Good. Okay. All right. So before we get to voter turnout, this is what our person is going to talk about. We're going to go through D2L very briefly. May not have time to watch all the stuff, but here we go. It's okay. Let it go yellow. Let it go yellow. And all done? Okay, excellent. Okay, we're having problems with our color thing here. So, okay, what do I do here? Okay, come on. Not that much. I don't think this computer. I'll try that. Yeah, okay. Okay. All right. You guys see this? Okay. So I swiped this off the internet because this is something we often say when someone is not doing something correctly. And you'll get access to this, so you don't have to write all this stuff down. I'm going to go through it quickly. You can just, if I say anything extra, you can talk about that. Okay. Facts should never get in the way of a good story. So if someone's, done a terrible story, it's not accurate, or you're doing something for, the wrong reasons, we often say that. Facts should never get in the way of a good story. Now, we talked last time about something called AIR. What does AIR stand for? What does A stand for? Accuracy. I, impartiality. Very good. R. Anybody? Responsibility. Thank you. So far, only got through to one of you. Okay. Remember that. So AIR, we talked about it, and that's part of that is the basis of what journalists are meant to do. But we also have codes of conduct. Now, I don't know if we have, but what the hell. Okay, so codes of conduct. Now, I'm going to show you an example of one of those. This is from a series called The Newsroom. And they did this series with the idea that, hey, we're going to do a story about a news organization that runs the way one should. It's not always easy. You've got a lot of obstacles ahead of you when you're trying to do your job as a journalist correctly, ethically, and so on. You have people who own the business coming down and wanting you to make money for them. You've got all sorts of things. So they decided we're going to do this show about a newsroom that does it right and all the issues that they run into. And it was a great series. So this is an example here of when they got this story, and you can see that it's breaking news, one. You can see that they're all trying to get more than one source to confirm everything that they're getting in, and they're in a hurry to do it because it's breaking news, and they're trying to get out there. See some problems that they start to encounter, and then you can see the owner coming in, and a dispute erupts. He wants them to go with something the other news organizations are saying, and they're saying, we can't do it. And you'll see what happens, okay? There we go, and hopefully we can hear this.
Oops.
Okay.
I'll start it over.
Thank you. That's okay. Didn't miss anything.
Heads up! What's going on?
All hands, there's been a shooting at Tucson and a Congresswoman Gabrielle Giffords been shot in the head.
This is based on a true story, by the way.
Give me our Tucson affiliate.
Charlie Skinner, New York, control break begin in 15 minutes.
I'm giving you a phone number. Quickly, Lieutenant Carl Bolshansky, Tucson Peach.
Gary, I need to be able to talk to a goddamn correspondent on the ground. The shooter's in custody. Who is he? How'd they get him?
Everybody else, who's recording their next album?
Cutting in for appropriate breaking news, the local Tucson newspapers report that Arizona Congresswoman Gabrielle Giffords has been shot while holding a public event in Tucson outside a grocery store. Possibly as many as 12 others have been rushed to an area hospital according to...
We're now learning that 3 members of Gabrielle Giffords' staff were among those wounded and rushed to University Medical Center in Tucson.
Does he have an arrest record?
We've had him for over an hour now. How could they not know who he is?
He's not going on the air with me. No, an arrest record. Okay, can you tell me if the Congresswoman's district office has received any drugs? Yeah.
And Peter's saying she's in.
Anyone else?
No.
She's not dead yet.
Just joining us, a gunman in Arizona fired.
Fox and MSNBC and CNN are on.
Let me hear MSNBC. A sole source of information that reports that the Arizona Congresswoman Gabrielle Giffords has been killed in this heinous attempt on her life.
Sure.
Why is he called again?
I don't have that.
Jim, why is he called?
Terry, I'm in the hospital.
Is it CNN, MSNBC, and Fox say she's dead?
They're all going with the same idea, and we're not satisfied.
Shit.
Hey!
From what is going now on the interview, Gabrielle Giffords gave this last year. This is Congresswoman Giffords.
All right,
Let's go ahead.
Oh, who's security?
every second you're not current. 1,000 people are changing the channel for their values. That's the business. MSNBC, Fox, and CNN all say she's dead. Don, tell them. Don.
It's a person. A doctor pronounces it dead, not the news.
Hearing, we can't behind.
She's alive.
Who's telling you that?
The anesthesiologist is being prepped for surgery.
Go alive if you got called the wrong, she's alive.
She's alive.
Yeah.
All right, we're learning now that Giffords is being prepped for surgery. At the hospital. What can you tell us?
You're a fucking newsman, guy. I ever tell you what to write? You punch me in the face.
Taylor, you're back in burn.
Back in person.
Okay, so we have to interrupt this now and go to our thing. But I'll continue on with the lecture later. That was just an example of what we're talking about. Okay, let's get the lights. So, Peggy's our guest there. Do not disconnect. Okay. So let's shift over to the handout I gave you guys. Okay. Let's take a quick look at it. This is a lovely PowerPoint presentation that I that I printed out for you. And these are some of the things that our guest today is going to speak about. So, Dan Rowe is from Humber College, okay? And here you see some news clippings of the Oshawa Times being shut down. Okay, we'll talk more about that. On the second page, Peter
Hey Jason, can you hear me?
Wait, you're on this
I can you hear me? Yeah, I can hear you. Okay. Great. Okay. Second, just checking the stream. Yep, good stuff. We got your split screen. Perfect. So audio and video is good. Can we just get somebody in the Langara College to just wave at us? People wave in the room if you can just hear us. Just want to make sure you're hearing us. Anybody? Anybody in Langara College? Can you guys hear us?
We can hear you. We can hear you.
You can? Okay, thank you so much. All right, Lon, everything seems great. I'm going to go ahead and mute myself. Go ahead. Yeah, so Jason, are they connected with 512 kbps? Because it seems like they are connected with low bandwidth.
No,
they're connected at 1920, so that's 2 megabytes. And you are connected at 4096, so it's twice as much. But yeah, no, they're really sharp here on the stream and everything else, so... Okay. So, Jason, if you can just enable live stream and recording for this session, that would be great. And this session will be till 3 o'clock. Everything's already enabled and streaming. Everything's good to go. Okay, thanks, Jason. Thank you.
Please remember significance, interesting views, right, for your needs. Okay.
So we'll have some time afterwards to discuss this and whatever's on to the further. I think there's two cases notes. We'll talk about that.
I think it's fun. Oh, who's that? The sheets are so safe. Like the sheets. The lack of cushioning left of us up and sometimes it often hurts. I think so. Yeah. Well, okay, who wants to play rock, paper, scissors? I know, I'm really disappointed. I'm insulted they should be interested in how incredibly interested they are. Come on, with some Vancouver guys.
They have the same chairs from the seminar.
I never once had those. Oh my god, and the chairs have cup holders?
Man, which place is this?
Durham College. Actually, bad grade. Sure, looks like he's going for a really tough time right now. He's not back, so my girlfriend just broke up. He's okay. Oh, I hope that's stressful.
Guys, what about all the way? Just to clarify, registers. You'll have to and I'll have the team ready. And I will to my numbers. Just explain it. I need to gather money and then buy the tickets once on a credit card. Okay, so that's what we're doing right now. And I'm going to start to have a list of people who say they want to come, and a list of people who. And as we get closer, I'll let you know. Yeah, turn off.
Email, like you said, we got 60% off discount on the website in the 180s. And you put it at the 68. 68. Okay, so we get saying.
That's your, yeah, that's the email I want to RCC meeting here, we're in a bit of a spot next to the spot with, okay? So I see where the room fits both classes, so we're going to do the classes just like this. Okay? So if we don't get everything done today for our lecture, we will. And I told you about the next one for today.
True. And it's so expensive. It's such a big thing. I can never finish it. That's what she said.
Can I grab everybody's attention, please?
I'm playing Cookie Cupcakes, so.
Fantastic. So, Durham College journalism students meet Langara journalism students.
Hello.
Hi, guys.
Great
to see you. Welcome to this side of the room.
Yes, from coast to coast. Well, not quite. We're in the middle. So, we have our guest with us, Dan Rowe from Humber College, and I met Dan at a local news conference, which is also where I met Effie Klein, and I didn't see you in there, Effie. Are you there?
Oh, I got down in the back there.
Hello, I can hear your voice.
Can you see me?
There you are. Great. And Dan said that he met you briefly. He met you briefly as well. So this is our first class that we've done this way, and it's being live streamed on the globalclass.org, and it will also be up on the globalclass.org. Afterwards, you can download it. You can watch it again on the website. So
watching people.
Other people could be watching us.
That's so crazy.
Okay.
I don't look good today.
All right. You look fabulous. Don't worry about it. All right. So, without further ado, I'm going to introduce Dan. And the question that I asked, that I put to Dan, is why is journalism important? So, over to you, Dan.
Great. That's a big question. Thank you. First of all, thank you for having me. And I'm super excited to be at Durham. I grew up around here. I'm from Bowmanville. I mean, I say Bowmanville, and when I'm teaching like at Humber, nobody even knows what Bowmanville is. But I feel like here I can even say where I'm actually from, which is Orono. Yes. Are there some Bowmanville and Orono? This means nothing to the Vancouver people, so I'll stop. But I did live out there for a while too. But anyway, this is it's great. We'll talk about Bowmanville and Orono and those sorts of things after. So the way that I'm going to sort of come at this topic is to try to sort of localize it, I guess, in some way. In the last year or so, I've been working on a bit of a research project, which is still at the sort of early stages, which was inspired in part by the same thing that inspired that local news conference where we met, which was last spring at Ryerson. And that was that conference came about because, as you probably heard, or may have some sense of, a couple of newspapers, local newspapers closed in January 2016. The Guelph Mercury, locally, or somewhat locally, closed then, and then before that, or around the same time out on the West Coast, the Nanaimo Daily News closed in January 2016. And at that time, there were a lot of alarm bells. A lot of people in journalism, a lot of people who study journalism and media were really concerned. Was this just the first wave of newspapers beginning to close? And what would that mean for our understanding of the places where we live? As probably a lot of you know, like I said, I grew up in Bowmanville / Orono. I can say Orono here. You don't get information about the things that are happening in your community from watching the local news, from watching news in Toronto, or reading about the Toronto Star, or reading the Toronto Star. Like, it might be once in a while you're like, look, we're in the paper. Something, and Bowmanville's like, look, the zoo has done something terrible. And you're like, oh, look, oh, that's terrible. So. You have no idea about, what's happening at City Hall or Town Hall, as we would say in a place like that. It's hard to find out who's running for office. There's certainly no discussion of it in the Globe and Mail or in the news. So local news is incredibly important. And if it's starting to disappear, if the newspapers are starting to disappear, how are people going to learn about the world around them? How are people, right around them? Not the big, wide world, but the world, right next door. Yeah, go ahead.
In all fairness, there's still a lot of This Week newspapers we have, like Clarendon This Week, Oshawa, Whitby.
For sure, yeah, no, and I'll talk about that, and they're there. And so again, and that's true in Guelph and Nanaimo as well. But there was a concern that the daily newspapers were closing, right? So these daily newspapers that were producing, covering things that happened the day before and reporting them the same day and had that consistency. And I know that This Week papers and in this area certainly have a big imprint, and they've been around for a long time. But with the closing of daily newspapers, it led to a whole of these two particular daily newspapers. It led to a larger discussion about what are we going to do about local news? What's happening with local news? And again, there were a lot of elegies, in particular for certainly in the Southern Ontario area for what the Guelph Mercury meant. And being someone who grew up out this way and is much older than all of you, I remembered something that had happened in my teen years, which doesn't happen a lot. And that was the closing of the Oshawa Times newspaper, which happened in 1994. I suspect if any of you were alive, you were probably not readers of the paper at that time, not because of its quality, but because you probably couldn't even read if you were even alive. So the newspaper, it was a daily newspaper in Oshawa, had been published for over 100 years in various forms, and it closed. It was gone. I can get into the backstory a little bit of it. There was a strike, and the company that owned it, the Thompson family, which was then and is still now the richest family in Canada. They own the Globe and Mail. They're the primary shareholders in the Winnipeg Jets and all sorts of other things. Reuters, Thomson Reuters, hugely, hugely wealthy. It wasn't that the Oshawa Times was losing them money. It just wasn't making enough money. So they're like, we've had enough of this. We're closing it. So a quick question for you guys here. How many of you have any recollection or have even heard of the fact that there was a newspaper called the Oshawa Times? It's amazing. It's fascinating. So again, like I said, daily newspaper, came out every day. Covered all sorts of things, covered the area, had a circulation of about 21,000. When the newspaper closed, it was probably not its peak, but a daily circulation of about 21,000. It was, when it closed, it was sort of in a bit of a vacuum, right? It wasn't alongside some other closings, and it actually didn't have anything to do with the internet. Maybe one of the reasons why you have so little, not just your age, but one of the reasons you might have so little memory of the Oshawa Times is that it never even had a website. It was 1994. Most news organizations, at least in Canada, about a year or two later, they said, we should do something with this internet thing, and then they put up a website. The Oshawa Times never even had a chance. So, like if you search Oshawa Times or OshawaTimes.com, you actually, one of the first things you'll find online is people on various message boards saying, I had an uncle who says he works for a newspaper called the Oshawa Times, but I find no evidence for its existence. Can someone tell me if this is a real thing? Because again, it kind of disappeared. If you could switch to there we go. So again, it was a story that was covered, certainly not as widely as the closure of the Guelph paper, the Nanaimo paper, and it didn't lead to any big conferences where journalism professors and journalists got together to talk, what are we going to do now that the Oshawa Times is gone? People just kind of were like, oh, well, it's closed. That's too bad. Some people lost their jobs. That's unfortunate. There were some stories, like I said, in the Toronto newspapers about what was going to happen. This week, the Metroland newspaper is owned by the Star or by Torstar. They kind of ramped up their coverage a little bit, and some of the larger newspapers in the Toronto area, the Star, the Sun, decided that they were going to cover Durham region a little bit more intently, thinking there might be an audience there. That lasted about a year, and then it kind of stopped. For a while, there was even like a Durham region section, a couple pages long, that came out on Thursdays in the Toronto Star. And then you'd be able to look and see, like, oh, yeah, they mentioned our town, and then that quickly sort of went away. So what I wanted to find out with my research project is, there's a lot of discussion about what might happen to local political engagement, local community engagement in places where local newspapers are either shrinking or disappearing entirely, and where there's less local news. Because one of the things that we believe, might be interested in studying journalism, one of the reasons why I worked as a journalist and now teach journalism and believe it's so important is that journalism is, at its core, a way of learning about the world, make decisions for yourself about how to govern how to vote, about what policies you like, what policies you don't like. And if we don't have that information coming from daily newspapers and coming from other daily news sources, then presumably our engagement in our local communities and in the world around us will wither, because that's what, again, the theories, the notions about journalism and its importance is that it helps to sort of, the more that you consume the news and attend to the news, the more engaged you're going to be politically. And by political engagement, effectively I mean, are you going to vote? That's sort of the most basic level of political engagement, is that once every couple of years, whenever there's an election, you drag yourself away from whatever you might normally do and go put an X or two on a box, and then you vote. Political engagement could be a little bit more broad than that. It can also mean, actually volunteering for a campaign, giving money to a politician, although that seems crazy. Doesn't? I mean, yeah. So anyway, that's what I was looking at. If you could just skip ahead. And like I said, at the time, when this newspaper closed, when the Oshawa Times closed, there was concern that it was going to lead to problems for local news. It didn't really happen in the short term, but in the long term now, there's again the same type of concern. The other thing notable about the Oshawa Times, and I mean this with all due respect to everyone who worked on the Oshawa Times, is that there was an amazing reason people who were subscribed to Oshawa, and they're saying, the reason the Oshawa Times people here aren't that upset, which also got me thinking, that's someone else's opinion. I was 16 years old when it closed, so my media literacy skills were not quite as finely honed, I hope. But one of the questions that it also raised for me was the question of, is it enough to just have local news, like just have news, but do we need news that actually serves the community and that serves the community's purposes? And so that was kind of what I was trying to get. I'm going to skip ahead to the next one. I don't know, research question. This is kind of boring academic stuff here. But basically, did the Oshawa Times have any effect on political engagement in Oshawa? Did it have any effect on civic engagement? Civic engagement, a little bit different from political engagement. That has to do with, what's membership like in churches and other houses of worship? What's membership like in community groups, on sports teams? What's attendance, at local sporting events? That sort of thing. Finally, what did the loss of the Oshawa Times mean to the community and its understanding of itself? Right, because one of the things you probably already started to learn in this class, and again, one of the things that news journalism is supposed to do is reflect, some notion of what life is like. That is less reflection back onto the community, less depiction of what's happening in that community. Does people's understanding start to fracture, or do they sort of have a lack of an understanding?
Sorry to interrupt. I'm just there's a technical issue.
Oh no.
Sure.
Okay.
I'm the global classroom guy.
Okay.
So I'm just going to step for 2 seconds,
of course,
and then I'll be gone. Okay.
Yeah.
So just
that gives me a chance to
stay on the wave.
No problem.
Guys, can you see clearly in Vancouver the PowerPoint slide and everything, and also me and them? Yes? Thumb up?
Yeah,
great. Okay. Great. On the live stream, we were just having a little issue on the live stream. We'll correct that. But as long as you're okay, then that's all I wanted to check. Okay?
That's good. Usually when I'm in classes, I cause my own interruption by tripping over cords and walking backwards into walls. It's a real problem that I have. So I could still do that. Yes.
Have I done this a couple times already? Yes.
Yeah. Yes. The students are amazed that I am able to live in the world because I just while I'm teaching them. So there's still time, of course. There's still time for that to happen. So watch closely. So those are the research questions. First of all, do you guys have any questions? Kind of over. This is the front. Okay. So those are the big questions that I was looking for, that I wanted to answer, and how on earth am I going to possibly try to start to answer these questions? First of all, the newspaper closed now 23 years ago. Lots of things have changed about Oshawa surrounding community. The people there have changed. Many of the people that were working at the newspaper when it closed are no longer there, or have moved on to other things, or it's sort of a distant memory for them. I picked the brain of your coordinator here at Durham. I think he's still the coordinator, Brian Legree. Yeah.
Who worked for the Oshawa Times.
Who did. I read his stuff all the time in the Oshawa this week later. And he just couldn't understand why I wanted to keep asking him about this. And, like emailing him, he's like, why? I could just imagine, what is wrong with this person? Why won't he leave me alone? But anyway, he was very helpful. And I was trying to read as much about the paper as I could, but I was also trying to figure out actual empirical measures. Is there some way that I can try to quantify or get close to some quantification? What happened, again, on at least along these measures of political engagement, civic engagement. So, like I said, I've just begun this project. Things move very slowly in academia, as you probably know. And was that election turnout data. We can see every time there's an election, federal, provincial, municipal, we find that one of the things you report, one of the things you read about is what's the voter turnout. So presumably if there's strong local news, and local news is doing what local news is supposed to do and what journalism is supposed to do, people engaged, knowledgeable, and there will be some people will come vote. We know there's lots of people who don't vote in all sorts of different elections for different reasons. But that seemed like a really good starting place to see if there was anything, at the very least, distinctive about what had happened in Oshawa, or what was happening as the newspaper closed. So, but I thought, again, Oshawa, just in a vacuum, that's not really going to help me, right? Like, just looking at Oshawa's numbers, there could have been other things going on. There could have been a snowstorm on the day of an election. There could have been a big Generals game or something. Like any number of things could have happened to affect voter turnout. So I compared it to a bunch of other ridings in comparable cities around the GTA. I looked at places like Peterborough, Oakville, Brantford, Guelph, and St. Catharines to see, which also have, the other thing they have is they have ridings federally and provincially that encompass the bulk of the city, the same way that Oshawa does, right? There's a riding that's kind of there's some ridings that sort of bleed into other areas, but federally, politically, there's an Oshawa riding, and it's been relatively consistent over a period of time. Again, the boundaries changed a little bit, but going back pretty far, you could find that there's been that riding. So what I did is I started to look, finding some of the old printed documents and some of the online documents about actual voter turnout for these places. There it is right behind me. And what I found, this was incredibly just thrilling activity, this research. It's so fun. Sitting dusty books being pulled up out of the basement of the Toronto Reference Library. It's a great way to spend your summer. No one's convinced. I'm barely convinced. So what I found here, if you can look at this, and again, this is very sort of crude aggregate level data, right? At this point, like I said, there's lots of other potential factors. This is for federal elections, so when you're voting for the Prime Minister, this very light blue line that sort of trends kind of in the middle, it's almost difficult to see in this particular slide because it's the national voter turnout rate. And as you can see, it by and large is going down. I started it 20 years before the paper closed, so in the mid-1970s, and brought it up to the present day. The gray line that you can see that kind of dips down below the national average, and also a lot of the other ridings and cities in our cities aren't banging into things. I delivered on that at least. One of the things that you'll see is that voter turnout in Oshawa, in the Oshawa riding, considerably lower, noticeably lower than a lot of the other ridings that I compared it to. And I had no idea going into that. That was a total a bit of a surprise to me that it would be that low to that extent, and that was much lower than the national average. Another thing that was interesting to me, and it may be difficult to see again depending on where you are, is that the newspaper closed in 1994, so that happens here. The voter turnout rate is already low. It's already starting to be lower than the national average, lower than the provincial average, lower than some other comparable ridings, well before the newspaper stopped being published. Which suggests potentially a couple of things, and I'll get into them a little bit more. What does it suggest to you guys? Suggest some things to me, yeah?
It suggests there was some kind of influence.
Right. It might be a negative influence, though, right?
Yeah, don't know if it's positive or negative.
It's hard to say, yeah.
It definitely determines there's some kind of influence there.
Right. It seems like there's a difference. You know, the different data, the different pieces of data. So the question is, why is it different? Could be a negative influence, could be a positive influence. It could mean also that you see it continue sort of through into the 2000 election, and then it starts to sort of get closer to the average, or at least the low end of the average, into the 2000s, which also may suggest, again, knowing what I know as a former resident of the area, that there have been some changes in the makeup of this city, right? GM in that same period became a less consequential employer in this area. There's more people who live in this area and work in Toronto, are from Toronto, or commute to other parts of the GTA, and who live here, and that doesn't mean their connections aren't the same, but there's been a definite change in the population, and also just the demographics more broadly, which, again, I think also ties back to the question of the role of the daily newspaper in this case, the former daily newspaper, the Oshawa Times, and suggests that maybe its influence was not that significant. Again, and I'll get to some hypotheses that I come to in my a little bit later. There's another hand up. No? Did you have a hand up?
I did, but you already said what I was going to say.
What was it?
I was going to say maybe it could be like the demographic or the population could change.
Yeah, and I think that's a big factor. I mean, as we sort of skip ahead, and this sort of puts it in slightly starker relief, I think. What I did with this one is the sort of zero here represents the national average in those voter turnouts, and in this case, the light blue line is Oshawa. So you can see it's considerably lower, noticeably lower. In some cases, 5 or 10%, or 10 points, I should say, not percent, below the national average. And again, that's happening. It starts to happen in the mid-1980s, which is especially shocking. Again, shocking might be overstating it, but it was especially surprising to me. The election where that started to happen was 1988, which, if you're a student of ancient history now, you will know that was the free trade election, which was incredibly contentious, and incredibly contentious around here. The CAW at the time, I remember my father was an auto worker, and material was being brought home about how free trade, later NAFTA, was a bad thing, and how it was going to take away jobs and lead to the closure of GM. Those things almost happened, right? And yet the voter turnout in a riding like Oshawa was so much lower than the rest of the province. Now, again, another counterfact to that, or a counterpoint to that, is the fact that the local MP at the time was Ed Broadbent, who was enormously popular, right? He was the NDP leader. He was nationally known. He did very well in the elections, has been long-serving, so maybe there was no reason to vote because he was going to win. All of these are factors, at least federally, and that's what I'm trying to sort of get at with the next step of my research, is to try to look at other factors, other pieces of data, to try to measure which factors had more of a role, including where people got news about politics from. So we'll move on. I also looked at, again, I think the federal data that I just showed you was pretty pretty stark, at least. Provincially, it's the same thing. And in fact, the drop sort of starts earlier in the early 1980s. Oshawa is the orange line here. The dotted line is the provincial average. Voter turnout very low. And in some elections that I looked at, Oshawa had the Oshawa riding had the lowest voter turnout in the whole province. Again, not really clear why that happened, but there's a very low level of political engagement, which, if we believe the notion that journalism is supposed to help inform and engage people on some level, then what was going on here? That's, I think, a question to have. And then, again, even more stark relief, again, when I do the same thing I did with the previous, with the federal election data, you see it's just considerably lower. This is the one where it was the lowest in the province, almost 12 points, around 12 points lower than the provincial average in Oshawa. And again, that's 4 years before the newspaper actually shut down. So, as I mentioned before, raises a couple of questions about just these overall notions that we have about what journalism is supposed to do and what good journalism is supposed to do. And I think gets us to hopefully sort of point back and think back to why was voter turnout so low? What did the newspaper look like at that time? What was it covering? And when I see, when you see those letters and you hear what some people say about the newspaper at the time, it also raises questions about like the sort of the normative idea of what journalism is supposed to be, which is, I think, probably something you've been talking about here, or will be talking about here, and that's, we have these ideas of what journalism ought to be and what it can be and what it should be, and it doesn't always necessarily live up to that. And that's why you're here studying it, that's why you're learning about it, because you want to make it better and do better work when you get out there. But I think we also need, when we're thinking about having the discussions that are going on in this country and in others about newspapers, right? The post-media newspapers are in some financial trouble, right? There's lots of stories. They're laying people off. My students are worried about it the same as you guys probably are. And there's a lot of discussion about should the government step in to save them. And I think it's important to ask the question: should journalism, I think all of us in this room probably agree that it needs some support and preservation, but do we need to support places that maybe aren't serving the communities that they're supposed to serve? The research that I'm continuing to work on will hopefully get us closer to a question of, at least in this one case, of what was going on that there seemed to be such a disconnect in that this institution, the Oshawa Times, and the others that were producing news at the time in this area didn't seem to get through and didn't seem to create that engagement. Now, it's not all negative. The city of Oshawa, they're the most helpful people. You may not believe that. Maybe it's because I only had to deal with them on this. But the city of Oshawa's clerk's office has readily available the voter turnout in municipal elections. And the reason I don't have other cities there is not because I didn't try. In many cases, they just don't have it, except going back for a couple of years. So it wasn't useful to post it there. But this is the voter turnout in municipal elections in Oshawa. And you can see it goes down, but not considerably. It stays consistent even through the period where the newspaper closed. In fact, it spikes around the time that the newspaper closed. And given the timing of municipal elections, usually happening in November, the one in November of 1994 probably would have been just about the last thing. That's right here. That would have been almost the last before they went out on strike. So we'll skip ahead to the last slide. What I'm doing now is looking at, to addressing some of the points that you guys raised and that I raised earlier. I'm looking at census data to see if there's been changes in the populations. Is Oshawa has the education rates of the people who live in Oshawa with the arrival of I still don't know how to pronounce it. UOIT. UOIT. I'm sorry. Everyone used to call it OIT when it first started. UOIT. But when it, has that changed? Again, have the demographic changes that we talked about? General Motors playing less of a sort of prominent role, not just in Oshawa, but really in the whole region, and more people, having connections to Toronto, either coming from Toronto or working in Toronto. Has that sort of changed the makeup and the engagement in this area? And also Canadian election survey data, which is an amazing resource if you want to do like a large data journalism project. Basically, a group of academics, every time there's a federal election, do the biggest survey in the country, bigger than the polls that are reported on at the time, where they're tracking on a riding-by-riding basis. They're asking people all sorts of questions, not just who they're going to vote for, but how do they get news about politics? How do they get news in general? Do they go to church? How often do they go to church? Their interests, what groups they're a part of. They ask them everything, so that you can do all sorts of research. And so what I'm doing now is trying to dig through those data sets to be able to try to isolate a little bit more information about media habits in the Oshawa area and how they compare to some of those other areas outside Toronto, to see if maybe people weren't in this area consuming as much news or as much local news as they might have been in a place like Oakville or Peterborough, or maybe there are more demographic areas, and then, you know, I'll start to work on a formula to try to figure out effectively, to try to see if I can isolate the variables that lead to political engagement and get a sense of how important, if possible, how important journalism actually is in that equation. So that's what I'm working on. And again, the idea is that it hopefully gets to the question of how central are local news outlets to the life of local communities. You know, because as we see, and especially with the previous slide, people do get information. People are still, you know, without a daily newspaper. I know there are other outlets this week. There's local radio stations. There's social media. There's Chex has its newscast right out of from downtown Oshawa. I don't know what the audience numbers are like for that. How many of you guys attend to local news on a regular basis? By attend, that's my obnoxiously fancy academic word for like watching or reading. Yeah, a little bit. Semi-regular. How do you find? Sorry, we're gonna. Where do you find out about things that are happening in Oshawa or whatever community you lived in before you started school?
Usually I watch a lot of news, so usually I'll watch like the local news, and then I'll watch like the CTV news for like GTA, and then I'll like go online and read all the news.
When you say you watch news, is that the Chex, like the Oshawa newscast?
Yeah.
Or? Yeah? Okay. You have your hand up.
Well, now in order for me to find like Durham news, I'm a fan of like the Durham radio station on Facebook.
Yeah.
There's another one, and I get live updates.
Yeah, I follow them too. That's how I find out what's going on. It's sad to see that the 5 Points Mall is closing. I didn't realize there was nothing left in there. But,
you can still walk through it.
I think for me a big one is the Clarendon This Week website.
Mm-hmm.
I used to work for the company, so I would read the papers when I had them, but I don't get them delivered, so I just look it online.
Right. Yeah, and they do update things. Like it's not all necessarily strictly tied to the publication schedule, but I mean that's a place where you turn. Would you go there just sort of as part of? I'm going to put you on the spot, but I can ask others who answered. Do you go there just as part of like your sort of daily kind of news routine, as you're kind of, you know, waking up and kind of curious about what's happening in the world, or is it like, I'm stuck in traffic, or I heard a bunch of sirens raised by the campus or by my house, so now I kind of want to see if there's something on the news about that?
I prefer to read the paper,
yeah.
to be honest, because I work for the NP.
Okay.
I used to do the outreach, so I used to go through and find stories to
Yeah.
And to me, it's easier to look online.
Sure.
I like actually looking at it.
What about that idea that and again, I think this is a thing that journalism is supposed to do. I'm probably standing the other way.
Well, you can also ask Langara where they get their news if you want.
Yeah, Langara. Hello.
Do you guys want to chime in? Where do you guys get your news?
The newspaper.
Okay, newspaper.
Radio.
Twitter, radio.
TV.
Do you still? Okay. Now you're in a big city.
We did an exercise, a quiz, and they all had to read the paper. And I had a whole bunch of them asking me where they can possibly get a paper. So that'll give the explanation, I should say. At least half of them didn't know where to get a paper. So that'll give you an indication that's really accurate.
Let's bring that to the ask question.
Absolutely.
How many of you know where to get a paper?
The delivery
How many people know where to get a paper?
We deliver to your house. I don't pay for that.
Effie, we're at about 50% here too, I think.
So a slightly different question. Do you guys know where to get a local newspaper? Like, do you know where to get This Week? Yeah.
I used to deliver it.
Where would you get it? Well, other than online, like a physical version of the local newspaper. Where'd you get it?
Like if you don't get it like to your house or whatever,
Yeah.
you can go right to the actual
box.
place. Yeah.
The actual place.
Yeah, like the actual place where they're like.
Yeah, okay.
Banks and bakeries
right?
always have
they
them.
land in like a big lump at the end of your driveway still in a bag.
Well, they go.
Yep.
They go
get them Wednesdays and, well, I know for Bowmanville it's Wednesdays and Thursdays.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah, they took away Fridays.
They got rid of the Fridays.
It's useless.
Yeah.
You can get them at like the bank or.
The bank.
Or bakeries or coffee shops.
How good of a job? And this is a question I think that the folks at Langara can maybe answer too, or try to answer. How do you feel the local newspapers do? Again, whether it's the Oshawa This Week or the Province or the Sun or any of the local papers out there, even the smaller papers of the Strait, how well do they do, in your opinion, of reflecting your sense of your own back to you?
Okay, we have one.
Hi.
Oh.
Hi, my name's Allison. Thanks for doing this, for having this presentation and all. Yeah, it's kind of odd actually, because with this assignment for the quiz that we had to read the paper, I'm just not personally like a fan of the paper at all. I'm really in this program to see how in the online world and how media and credible resources can thrive in that. I really do believe they can thrive and profit from it. It's just a matter of very sharp digital marketing, I think, and getting the right businesses. But one thing that I just fail to see in the province is, like, I was talking with my classmate Myra about this, so the front page of the province yesterday was a picture of the Sedin twins. Okay, so the Canucks players saying that they vow to always be Canucks. Okay, that's cute, but it was on the front page, and it wasn't even the first paper. It was on the last page of the paper. And it just is I find that Vancouver News is sort of in this weird moment right now where it's kind of misleading what's important. And I think we're in this void of like wanting to entertain our readers, but also informing them. And it's just like, I honestly, look, I stuck with my dad is a sports fan. I know lots of sports fans, not bashing sports. But I get really bored of listening to the mainstream news, and I don't really go for those.
So are you saying they don't inform us or complacency? What are you saying?
Well, even with like the first 10 papers again, what we were supposed to read for this quiz, I was frankly quite bored because 2/3 of it was about the NDP's budget plan. It's like, okay, I get it, but I'm getting 4 different versions of what's in the budget plan.
Okay.
I start to form, you start to form your own opinions kind of quickly. I start to get reactions very quickly. So,
Trevor, you got something?
One of the problems with local newspapers with both the Daily Seeker are owned by the same company. So when we were the NDP provincial budgets, on speaking about that. One of the articles I read in the province, one of the major daily newspaper, was actually the exact same article that I had read in the Vancouver Sun. So there's a lack of diversity here.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, that's more hands. I'm pointing at the guy in the tube.
Which guy? Oh, right here? Okay.
Yeah.
Are you pointing to Langara?
Yes, Langara.
Yeah, I'll go pointing off in a different direction.
I know. I should have looked at the camera.
Yeah. Okay. Am I supposed to?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Anyway, yeah, I find that certainly with stuff like the Province and Vancouver Sun, it's much harder. I personally attend a lot of rallies, and the next day I like to find the news stories, and so I find that CTV, oddly enough, is the one that you find the most reliable sources from, which is weird because it's not one that you ever hear.
You have something?
That's interesting. That's interesting. I'm just going to speak to that.
Throw it over to you.
Teresa wants to say
I just want to say one thing. So there was a study that just came out. It was called the Reuters Digital Report on Canada's news consumption and what news sources we trust the most. And to speak to your point, CTV is the news source that Canadians trust the most, according to that digital report.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The and the lack of trust or the antipathy, I guess, for the Vancouver Sun and Province is longstanding. I interned out there a long time ago, and I remember I did a lot of arts reporting that summer. They were like understaffed, and I remember going to the Kitsilano Folk Fest, and just like people, they were selling buttons like about how terrible then Can West and the Vancouver Sun and Province. I didn't buy one though. I didn't think that would help with my long-term employment prospects. But yeah, I mean, like you're saying, at least at one point, local news and provincial news, there was a firewall between those two papers to some extent, and now, that's even gone away. So you're getting the same, in a lot of cases, same local and regional news in those publications. And I think the point that you made about the sports story being on the front page too, well, it might help to, I guess, maybe sell some papers to have the Sedin twins on the cover of a newspaper in Vancouver. I think a lot of people, I think there's a sense that that's the easy way out, and I think that's what you're kind of getting at in probably a far more eloquent way than, it's the safe route is to put the Sedins on the cover instead of, reporting a story or trying to, tell someone something new about their community. That's kind of the safe route. There's a question here in Oshawa. Yeah.
Hi. So I think, just talking more on the local side of the paper, I think the reason for me I like reading that is because it focuses more on, like, not just with our area, but there's a lot of good that goes on, particularly in our community in Bowmanville, and it highlights almost all of that. I mean, it can't highlight everything because, a newspaper is only a certain amount of pages, but if you were to compare something like the Toronto Star, for example, and compare that with what we have, you find there's a lot more, it focuses more on like what the media considers newsworthy, which is more serious things, whereas with something like that, it focuses on the good stuff and the community, so it shows that, like, yeah, there's a lot of bad stuff that happens out there, but look at all the good stuff this community's doing, look at, like, for once, it's like teenagers are in the newspaper not because they're beating each other up, but because they're involved in
with teenagers?
You know what I'm trying to get at, right?
Yeah, no, I do, and again, that's that also speaks again to the larger question of what a news outlet, and which, as you know now, no longer exists and hasn't for a long time. But I think we can broaden that to news outlets, and that can be anything from something more traditional and large, especially in the case of a city like Vancouver, to, I know locally in a lot of communities in Ontario, I mean, the main news source might now just be someone's Facebook page, or the most trusted source is just like a guy's Facebook page who writes about the things that are happening in the town he lives in, and they should probably be treated on some level equally. But, yeah, I think the question too is, the ultimate question I keep getting back to, even though I'm thinking about the Times and thinking about local news, is what should journalism be? What ought it to be? What are we trying to do here with journalism? Is it selling stuff? Is it entertaining people? Is it reflecting the community back in both a positive and negative way? Is it finding some balance there? And then once we sort of speak to that question of like what is it, and we can probably, if we had a discussion about that, you would fight about it and argue about it and quibble over it for the rest of time. But then the question then becomes, well, how does that compare to what we actually have? And where's that gap, and how do we fill in that gap, if there is a gap? And my assumption is, my feeling is, based on, again, just my observations of news in the world, and having worked in news and the research that I'm doing now, is that there is a gap. And so the question is, how do we fill that? How do we fill that gap? And it's, I think we're at, on some level, an exciting opportunity because there is so much change, right? It is a positive thing that there's so much change that I don't want journalists to lose their job ever. But I also think there may be opportunity to create or to forge sort of new models and new approaches that at least try to do a better job, that maybe aren't thinking about the profit motive quite so much, that aren't thinking how long has it been since we've had the Sedins on the cover of one of the papers, or how many more, the last time we put them on the cover, that many more copies were picked up. I think ideally, as more broadly the government and society has this discussion about how are we going to fund and support quality journalism in the future, for me, I think it can't necessarily just be saving the things that are already here. It has to be an adaptation process, and a big part of that is figuring out what and thinking, clearly and critically about what we really want from our journalism and from our news organizations. There's a hand up in Langara. I'm pointing in the wrong place. The blue T-shirt.
Yeah, it's that's me, right?
Yeah.
Okay. So it sounds like you have a real focus on data points, in terms of the way that it's informing. You're thinking about, you just said, I'm not necessarily interested in resurrecting old models of local, hyper-local community papers. I'm really open to media forms. And I'm sure that people are counting the numbers of papers that get sold or the number of hits they get on a website, but you're talking about data that is, demographic, and you're digging into census data. I know that you're working in an academic context, but in your experience working in papers, are media organizations paying this much attention to this much data? And if not, do you think it could benefit their articulation of their idea of themselves?
I mean, it's been a
Sorry,
long...
can you just rephrase the question? Because it may have been hard for some people to understand just with the cutting through. I don't know if we're cutting out on you guys. But
so the question was basically...
we're getting it.
You're getting it too.
Okay.
Yeah.
The question, and I hope I'm doing it justice here because it's a really good question, was to what extent are newsrooms thinking about these things and how much are they using data? I mean, it's been a while since I worked full-time in a newsroom. So I won't pretend to, have up to the, up to the minute of this. I think in a lot of cases, and this is very understandable, people are just in newsrooms right now are just trying to survive. And to the extent that a lot of newsrooms use data, like I was talking recently with a friend of mine who works as a web editor at a women's magazine that shall remain nameless, but there's only a couple of them, so you can probably guess. And they look at the Google Analytics every day, and the top stories, the most hits are not the Google Analytics, the Chartbeat, and the top stories are either what to watch on Netflix or the horoscope. So she's very smart. So she said, what to watch on Netflix based on your astrological sign. To combine the two, and it should be a massive smash, right? That would be, those are the two. So and that's just self-preservation. It's kind of clever self-preservation if it actually works. But yeah, I don't know, and it's not a new thing, and I don't think it's necessarily the journalist's fault. I need to make that very clear. When I talk about what was happening at the Oshawa Times, which I think was also happening at a lot of other newspapers and continues to happen, is that there's budgetary pressures. There have been massive cuts, and not just at newspapers, at news organizations more generally. It tends not to be because the journalists themselves are not doing their best. They're working incredibly hard and know, for the most part, what to do and how to do it. It's the constraints that are put in their way by budget, time, and all of these other factors. I don't think they're thinking about it enough, and I don't think they have been for a long time. I mentioned when I used to work out in Vancouver at the Sun, and I became friends with someone who was actually a student at Langara at the time. She came in to work in the newsroom on a local election night, and we would just talk a lot about journalism because I was pretty freshly out of journalism school, and she was still in journalism school and looking to get into it. And she was Syrian, and she was like, she's like, you're not going to be offended that I don't ever read the Vancouver Sun, right? She's like, it just does not reflect my life. It doesn't reflect the life of my family. She lived in the suburbs of Vancouver, and she's like, there's nothing for me in that paper. And that was 15 years ago. And I don't know that I think that's applicable to, you'd probably say similar things about the Toronto Star. The fact that when Rob Ford was running for mayor in Toronto, they had to do stories where they would just interview people who were like, why are you voting for Rob Ford? You know, because no one who worked at the newspaper could even fathom that someone would vote for him, despite the fact that he went on to win that election. There's a disconnect, I think, and it's multifaceted. The reason it's there, I don't think it's done intentionally. It's who ends up working in newsrooms, who runs newsrooms, who owns newspapers, who they think buys newspapers, or you know, more broadly consumes news products. That lead to this particular disconnect and lead to the fact that, again, many news organizations are not doing as much as they can to actually reflect the community that they're ultimately trying to serve on the high ideal level, and then at the sort of crass business level that they're actually just trying to get to consume their product.
So I'm just going to interject here and just start wrapping things up a little bit, just because we've used. Thank you so much, Dan, for your time. And just to speak to your point, I don't know if anybody saw the article in the Star. I know when I lived in Vancouver, I never read the Toronto Star, and it took 5 years to start picking it up since I moved here. But the Toronto Star has a new beat based on an Atkinson Fellowship. Have you guys heard about that out in Vancouver? So does anyone here know?
No.
Yes.
Oh, sorry.
So Sabrina Nanji is going to be looking at democracy specifically, and I think that relates a lot to this conversation, because we are looking at voter turnout related to local news. So she might be somebody that might be interesting to talk
Yeah,
about these things.
for sure. And I think it's good that people are breaking into beats, to the traditional beats.
Sorry, go ahead, Effie.
No, I was just saying that you've given us a lot to talk about for sure. Just with this, the information you've given us, Dan. There's so many questions that come up in my mind and things that I can see us discussing after this for sure.
Good, I'm glad. I hope it was helpful.
All right. So, Effie, I hope maybe we can arrange to have you come visit us this way again. We'll get used to this format a little bit more.
Hello.
Yes. All right.
Yes.
I've been in that classroom, I think, so it's nice to see it from this side of the country.
Yes, it's nice and big and can fit all of us, so it's good. We've got 2 of our classes in here, so thank you. This is wonderful. We can get them in here to talk about this, and it's perfect timing, too, in terms of my lecture. It falls exactly where it should, so you guys timed it perfectly.
Wonderful. Okay, well, thank you so much, Langara, and we hope you have a good rest of your day.
Thanks.
Thank you very much.
Bye. Bye.
Okay, thanks for meeting.